Hello and welcome to today's episode of Date in a Blink, where we're joined by Elizabeth Dell, a trained sex educator and founder of Amorus.
Modern dating sucks, but it doesn't have to. Here on the Date in a Blink podcast, you'll listen in on 10-minute voice-only speed dates between strangers. The experience is designed to move people beyond mindless swiping and marathon messaging. Our position on online dating? It's time to stop collecting pen pals and start, going on actual dates.
Online dating? That actually involves dating? Is that even a thing anymore? But for real, dating should be fun. We hope listening in inspires y'all to try new ways of meeting people. Tune in every other week to hear a new couple go on a date. In between, we'll talk to relationship experts about how the date went and what we can learn from it.
Will our handpicked podcast matches find love on these Blink dates? Or will they say goodbye to each other after 10 minutes and never look back? Tune in to find out.
Before we jump into today's episode, here's a quick word from our sponsors.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain a bit. It's totally free, and Anchor will distribute the podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and lots of other podcasting platforms. Not only that, but it has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. It also lets you make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make your podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Today on Date in a Blink, we are thrilled to be joined by Elizabeth Dell, a trained sex educator with a master's in public health from UC Berkeley. She was previously a film producer, producing multiple indie features, including Destination Wedding, starring Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves. Amorus brings together her career of storytelling and her lifetime interest in sexuality to help partners everywhere tell each other the most delicious stories. With that being said, Elizabeth, welcome. We are so happy to have you on today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. So Amorous is an app for couples that make their communication more, to use a word from the website, delicious. And I love that term in this context. Could you give us a rundown of what it means to make couples and their conversations more delicious and how Amorous helps them achieve that?
Yeah. So for me, Amorous was was inspired at the beginning of the pandemic from going into lockdown without my partner in cohabitating with me and having to do all of that romance and play and intimacy on my phone and thinking, oh, well, I'll just get an app for that. I have an app for everything else. I'm sure this will be great. Only to discover that there wasn't really anything that would help me connect, help me get ideas for what to talk about, help me feel safe and private, help me feel connected to my partner. And so I decided I would go build it. And so Amorous is a relationship intimacy and romance app. At its core, it's messaging because honestly, the person you want to talk to is your person. But built around that is a whole suite of games, of security and privacy provisions, of all of the tools that you need to be able to do that on your phone in a way that feels really, really good. And to do that from a place of hey, let's discover shared desires. Let's start sexy new conversations. Let's be delicious and have so much fun together.
So I have a question, and forgive me if the answer should be obvious, but for all the listeners who don't yet know, now that we're in this world where we're kind of still virtual, but still we're coming back into that in real life experience, does Amorous, is it able to support kind of people exploring how to make their relationships more delicious in both contexts?
Absolutely. I mean, just because we're in the real world now, which is amazing, doesn't mean we have stopped using our phones, right? It is a combination.
What are you talking about? I threw mine out.
Exactly. So, we have everything from people using Amorous so that there's, hey, well, I'm out in the course of my day, I get a cool, fun ping from my person and go, oh, they love me. And listen, people have asked me, can't I do that on SMS text? And I'm like, yes, you can. But when I look down at that, I don't immediately know it's fun and sexy and playful and caring, because that might be about how I forgot to do the laundry. Mm-hmm. Or that might be about hey, can you pick up milk? I don't get excited necessarily when I see an SMS text from my partner, because most of the time that's logistics. But when you've got Amorous, even before you open it, oh, they're thinking about me because they sent me an Amorous message. also all of our tools, and especially our games, are designed to be things that you can take into the real world. So
Mhm.
our sexy conversation starters, start a conversation about what smell turns you on, and then go get that Yankee Candle. Um, or, we have a game called Fantasy Swipe, which is all about matching desires with your partner. So
Mm.
you can swipe desires you want, yes and no, they do the same, and your matches are revealed. So if you guys just learned that librarian student happens to be a fantasy for both of you, hey, maybe that's what Saturday night's gonna be about.
I love this so much. And it really kind of calls out how space is so important and how creating a space for these sorts of conversations can make them feel a lot more natural. And I think just thinking kind of more broadly, like being vulnerable, especially when it comes to sexuality, usually requires, like you said, like a sense of comfort and safety. And I'm wondering if you could actually share some thoughts about how you think online spaces generally present some challenges for the creation of that comfort and safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of understandable how it happened, but for the average dating app, their incentives are entirely misaligned with kind of comfort and safety. Like their incentives are to give you a really big pool of people, which I
Mhm.
understand why that's really important, but they don't want to do anything that's going to make people not want to be there. And something like, "Hey, we will have standards for your behavior," makes some people not want to be there. And so what we don't have is ways to like enforce appropriate behaviors. A lot of times it incentivizes people to play the game of a dating app, but not actually with the goal of a connection. Because
Mhm.
if you connect, then you stop playing. Um, which
The
is
way
really
we like to think about it is that it's a matching app. So it's not actually meant for the development of the connection. It's meant to just match you with people based on,
yeah.
a profile.
And when you're doing that, you don't have the kinds of, I mean, with an Uber, we have ratings of drivers and of passengers because
Mhm.
people are like, I don't want to get in a car with someone doesn't have, who I do not trust to have their, commonsensical good behavior on. But we
Mhm.
don't have, metrics like that in a dating app. You can't look on a Tinder person and be like, hey, this person has never been red flagged, or this
Right.
person's been red flagged a dozen times. Let's be careful about what conversation we're having with them.
Right.
And so it incentivizes people to not worry about good behavior, which is an unfortunate side effect.
Mhm. And I'm wondering on the flip side of it, do you think that online spaces have offered additional opportunities for comfort and safety?
I think it's a blend, in there are lots of spaces like sexuality in where the desires, or like societal's prevalent decision making, that's a terrible way to say that. Society's rules and regulations are really restrictive and really sex negative. And
Mhm.
so finding spaces, whether those are because you're anonymous or because you've restricted the group to only people who are in tribe or are interested, you can find a lot of safety online. If you're
Mhm.
a trans kid in Kansas, there is so much more safety to be found online than off, but that does not mean that there are not spaces online that can also be completely terrible. And
Right.
so it's finding that balance of how do you create spaces that have standards of good behavior, but maybe not standards of restrictive sex negative behavior.
Right.
That's a thing that I think about all the time.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you're making a space like that. So it's really awesome.
Yeah. And I think everybody, we're thinking about it in different ways. You're making a space to meet people with a lot of that. I'm making a space to create that with the person that you've met.
Yeah.
So, how do you feel confident that if you share something, you can always take it back? How do you feel confident that being on Amorus is not something that other people will see and judge you for, because you will only exist to the one or two, or actually, to be fair, however many one-on-one partners you want to invite if
Yeah.
you're ethically non-monogamous, but you only exist in relation directly to that other person. There's
Right.
no one who can go see you on Amorus and decide that they're going to judge what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah. And this is an incredibly apropos segue for one of the things that we saw in a previous interview that you did was you mentioned that there was a survey where people were asked about their hesitancies regarding sexual communication. And surprisingly, the number one response was, I will be too honest. And for me, that's just totally
Yeah.
wild. I feel like that was really surprising for me to hear. So I'm curious, in your opinion, what does this say about how people feel about their own sexuality as well as their perception of kind of the sexuality of others?
Yeah. It was totally wild, honestly, for me to see, and heartbreaking, honestly. And I think it comes from a lot of places, and you can point a figure at porn or point a figure at whatever, but honestly, I think it starts on a playground, right? It starts as a little kid on a playground where you learn the lesson really quickly that if you're the kid who gets curious and excited and wants to learn more when someone has a sex story, other kids might point and laugh at you or call you a pervert or call you weird. But if you lean back and say, I don't want that, then nobody will ever judge you. You will be safe. And we get taught that so early that most of us have this instinctive, every time someone talks about sex that I don't understand or I'm not sure of or I don't know or I feel uncertain about, I'm going to lean back. I'm going to retract. I'm going to respond with disgust or with reserve or with judgment because that is a safe response. The problem is that then you end up in situations where maybe a partner says something to you and you react instinctively and they feel really judged or and then they get the message, oh, this isn't a safe space, or they've got the message from all their partners in the past that talking about my sexuality is going to get me judged or it's going to get me called a pervert or it's going to, and we don't have a lot of spaces in which we model people being honest about their sexuality and just presenting it as themselves. I think it gets echoed and echoed and echoed in porn in the ways that while there are these pockets of like the most extreme behaviors, there also is a very specific gaze that everything kind of flows through. And it says, here are the top 10 things that you should want in sex. And when I think about it, I had someone the other day tell me trying to learn sex from porn is trying to learn driving from Fast and the Furious. Like it's just
That's
not an
amazing.
appropriate response. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's a really good analogy. But how do we show people that honesty in sexuality is something that can be welcomed and rewarded? And for me, with Amorus, a big part of our sexy conversation starters are how do we help you practice having conversations around sex that go well? I can't guarantee that every conversation you have with your partner is going to go well, but having sexy conversation starters like what smell turns you on, or what's the most erotic thing you've ever worn, or what's a song that you always want at the top of your sexy playlist. Have that conversation, move on to the next, have that mutual back and forth of, oh, hey, I had this conversation and my partner responded positively. He put that on our playlist next week, or, we went shopping for lingerie together, or whatever that is. And then you're comfortable with the next conversation and the next and the next. But how do we help people practice and model that behavior with each other? I mean, that's the sort of serious educator version of, hey, I want you all to talk about sex and be delicious and have fun.
It's it's so interesting for me to hear you say these things because sex really is such a taboo topic. It's one of those things that people don't really talk about it at the dinner table. Obviously, I think that makes people uncomfortable. Even just thinking about the people that you know, even if they're friends. I know people get really weird about talking about sex with family and people like that. But it's just so funny because if you don't see that modeled, and the only place you see it modeled is in places that it's really inappropriate, or things that don't sit well with you, it's easy to feel weird or othered or uncomfortable about it. And so I think one of the only places people really have the space to talk about those things is in therapy, because it feels like a safe, non-judgmental space. And so I'm curious, when
Yeah.
you're thinking about how you encourage people to start beginning to have these conversations, there's almost a little bit of like, I want to say like a Puritan vibe that people have around talking about sex. And so I'm like totally obsessed with this concept of like, how do you encourage couples to talk about it? Especially, I think this is helpful to start a new relationship, but especially as I'm thinking about relationships once they're out of the lust phase and they're in that long term loving phase with each other, things can get into a routine. You can kind of feel like, oh, I already know a lot about my partner, or, we never talked about it while we were in the lust phase. And so now it just feels weird to talk about it. And so I'm curious, how do you think about kind of creating those sorts of spaces, especially for people who might be in, a little further down the line and they're dating with somebody, to kind of keep it sexy, keep it fun, keep it light. How do you dip your toes in the water? Because I think about answering the question of, like, what's a smell that turns you on? And immediately my response is like, oh, I don't know. I don't even know how to think about that. So how do you think about that? I'm curious.
Well, I think part of it is presenting a new space. That's one of the wonderful things about Amorus as an app, or about a date in a box that comes to your house that you send away for, or a game like We Are Not Really Strangers that's about values and talking about how do you engage in relationship. It gives you a new context in which to ask new questions. We have people who use Amorous for chatting back and forth because they're a long distance couple. I was talking to someone the other day who was like, actually, we've never really messaged on your app, but we find the games really fun. So we just sat on the couch and like push the chat sparks button and talk about all the questions that get asked with each other. Like we just, but again, it's the asking of that question. You don't have to have an answer for what smell turns you on, but now you're thinking about it. Maybe now you're like in the CVS walking down the aisle and going, oh, interesting. Here's a new way for me to think about my sensuality, my pleasure. And maybe there's a different question that you have with your partner. I think, again, it's this one, we all like to have routines, and routines make it easier to think. So if you have a routine, you don't have to think about something. If you have a habit, you don't have to think about it, and it frees up space to think about other stuff. But also, sometimes when we move out of the lust phase, we sort of feel like we're not allowed to go back in it, that we've established our patterns and now we can't break them because then it would be strange. Like we have a pattern, why would we change it? And so I think sometimes changing the context, this is why you like go on a sexy weekend away, because you're in a new context and you can have new conversations that aren't the conversations that you're supposed to, and I have air quotes happening here, have in your bedroom, right? We've gotten in the rhythm of in bedroom, we have these conversations and not those. So maybe if we go to a hotel room in Fiji, well, we don't have a habit of what we talk about in hotel rooms in Fiji. So we can have new conversations. And so I think something like, and that's a huge part of why Amorous was designed, is how do we use games and fun and play to help introduce novelty and spontaneity again, and ask new questions and give you new ways to interact with each other.
So, a question for you, since we've sort of talked a little bit about how to start broaching these conversations with our partners if we're interested in having them, but going back to what you had mentioned earlier about why, people might feel anxious about having these conversations to begin with, a lot of that is internal. And even if we're really comfortable with someone, and we know them very well, and we feel very intimate with them, we can sometimes struggle to get over some of those internal hangups. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on how we can work through that. I know therapy obviously is one of those, but if there's anything that folks can start doing on their own to start feeling more comfortable broaching those raw conversations about sex and kind of, all of those other delicious things.
So I would give a few pieces of advice. One, I would say start with yourself. I'm a really big fan that part of getting comfortable with anything is practice, right? It's practice, practice, practice. So can you journal about what's sexy to you? Can you write yourself your own little voice note, or talk yourself a voice note, or write something on your phone? But practice the act of talking about your own pleasure to yourself. What is exciting to you? What's sexy to you? What makes you hot? Also, and in part and parcel of that is exploring your own pleasure and sexuality. I think a lot of us aren't always sure what it is that's really exciting. And so it's really hard to articulate to someone else if you don't know yourself. So going on some thinking about how do I like touch or what thoughts arouse me. And so then you have a context for, okay, that's a thing that I know that I want, and then I can share that want with my partner. But so I would say understanding yourself and your own pleasure. And of course, these are evolving things. One never
Mhm.
knows everything about oneself. Like we are creatures that constantly evolve, but understanding some of what your own pleasure is and getting better at that and then practicing writing it. Another way to practice is dirty talk. A
Mhm.
little, even the littlest bit of whether it's nonverbal, oh, or like that's really hot, or I loved it when you did that. A little bit of practice in the bedroom. The most of the time, I don't want to give a 100% guarantee, but most of the time, expressing to a partner that you want something or that you would need something is a really good way to get it. And that positive feedback, oh, I love it when you give me a back massage, and then I got a back massage, makes it like, oh, great. Now let me ask for something else. How about you kiss my neck? How about you run your fingers through my hair? How about you massage my feet? Practicing and having that back and forth and that positive feedback, that the point is not that we should become extraordinary erotic fiction writers overnight together. The point is that we start doing a little delicious thing, and then once that's delicious, we do a little bit more and a little bit more, and find the things that you like and the things that you don't and pursue them. So I'd say start small is also a lot of that comes together in start small.
This, I am so fascinated because I feel for a lot of people, and I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking this, view intimacy, even when you're with someone for such a long time, view intimacy, especially when you're talking about like sexual or sensual intimacy, as a performance. And the fact that you're saying
Mm.
practice, I think that that's a really important distinction because a lot of people probably don't view any type of sexual encounter with somebody or even a sensual encounter with somebody as, a practice or a repetition or training or, things like that. It's essentially a muscle that you have to build. And I think that there can be a lot of fear. And I'm now making this connection as you're talking that it's wild to me that sex feels so performative. Like, and I'm just going to talk specifically about
Mhm.
sex. That sex can feel so performative, and it feels like oh, this is the final act. Even if you've had sex with this person, 100 times before, I feel a lot of us have that. It's that stage fright and these fears that really come up because we're not
Mhm.
necessarily viewing it as a form of practice or training or cooperative
Yeah.
participation to try to build
It
something together.
I mean, it really like, it's a skill like any other, and
Yeah.
if you wanna be good at cooking, you don't sort of watch, Nigella or someone and be like, "Oh, I have to show up in the kitchen and be her, and if I don't, I clearly must not know how to cook, and I've never like, I shouldn't start anymore, I shouldn't try anymore." We don't
Yeah.
walk out onto a tennis court and say, "If I can't be Andre Agassi today, then clearly I'm not gifted in this and I should not try ever." But we somehow do that in sexuality a lot. We show up and think that if I'm not a porn star on day one, clearly my sex is wrong or my intimacy and my pleasure is something that I'm just bad at. Whereas in our, like, even in just talking to our partner, that's a thing that we get better at. That's the process of being in a relationship for years, is getting better at being with a
Yeah.
person and gaining skills in a kitchen. You gain skills in a bedroom, and those skills can be, exactly how you move your fingers and your tongue in a certain way, but those skills can also be, how do you communicate your desires, and skills around how do you understand your pleasure, and how do you
Mm.
understand the ways and the hows and the wherefores of what turns you on, and the ways and the wheres and the how-fores of like what turns you off.
Mm.
I think another big part of this is exploring, where are the things that turn me down, like what turns the dial down, because sometimes avoiding what turns the dial down is as important or more important as understanding what turns the dial up, right? If I
Yeah.
don't feel safe in this space, or if I feel like I'm being rushed for time, that always makes me lose my libido. Okay,
Mm.
great. Then it's really silly for your partner to be constantly approaching you at 7:45 in the morning, and then you reject them, and then they don't understand why they're always being rejected. But if you guys can explore together, oh, hey, this, like, feeling like my alarm clock's going to go off is something that's really bad for me. Like, for some people that might be like, oh, this is so cool, we have to do a quickie and this is really exciting. But for other people, it's like, absolutely not. So it's like, hey, stop asking at 7:45 a.m. on Tuesdays, but let's absolutely plan for like 7 p.m. and the rest of the night on Saturday. That can make a huge difference. But that's the kind of thing that you don't walk into a relationship knowing. You work at it. That's a skill. Like, learning that is part of the skill of intimacy.
Yeah. And I also, kind of diving a little bit deeper into that, one of the things that I know makes people, not everybody, but a lot of people, I think, feel uncomfortable with sexy talk is because I think there's a twofold fear. There's a fear that they're going to wind up saying something that's embarrassing or saying the wrong thing. And so there's that kind of, I feel self rejection, right? Where, oh, what if I say the wrong thing? Or I think I'm saying something sexy and it comes out really unsexy. And then this person responds in a way that's a little repulsive and now I feel bad. Or what if I say something that, I'm saying it to the other person and then now they have some rejection sensitivity because of it. Like, let's say you're trying to encourage somebody to do more of something that you really like. And what if they end up, interpreting that not as, what if they interpret that as criticism and now you've kind of shut them down? So I'm curious, what advice do you have for listeners when it comes to overcoming those sorts of fears, if that's something that they want to, and embracing this sort of like delicious, intimate chat that Amorus helps facilitate?
I have 2 strategies for that I would point to.
Love it.
Strategy 1 is embrace the awkward. Tell someone you're bad at something, because when you tell them you're bad at it, you have removed all standards of being good at it. Then if you do something that's really crazy hot, like, woohoo, beginner's luck, you're a genius.
Yeah.
So I'm a really big fan of being like, hey, I might be really bad at this, but like, I think it'd be fun to do.
Yeah.
It allows you, play. One of the things that I think is beautiful about play, and just no matter what age or when, is that play allows us to fail, right? When we're playing a video game, we're gonna like run in and get killed by the bronchosaur a billion times, and then it's just gonna respawn us, and then we're gonna go and be like, okay, now I'm gonna figure out a new strategy to kill my bronchosaur, or whatever that is. And failing is just part of the process of getting to the win. And so I think if you embrace that, and one of the ways I love to embrace that is being like, hey, I might be super awkward at this. And if I am, like, all right, we'll figure it out, or I have been known in my sexting, like with a long pause, to sometimes text my partner and be like, so that was a boner killer? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Just embrace the like, oh, I might have effed that up, but like, that isn't, the cost of that is just stopping and restarting. And I think your partner is almost always having a lot of those similar fears. And so if you can establish, we are both allowed to be bad here, and the cost of failure is going to be that we have to try again and no more than that, you set a baseline where both people are excited to try and to be there and to move forward. The other big strategy is ask questions. I think we do sometimes have this idea that we should know all and be great at all before we start. And in fact, that can be counterproductive, because sexy talk, intimacy, it is all about connection with the other person. It is all about engaging with the other person, being responsive to the other person. So if you know everything to do in advance, what that means is you are not paying attention to your partner, because it will be different with whoever that partner is. And so if you're not in that moment with them, then you're running your own script, which is not actually really delicious engagement with your partner. And so if you're asking questions, is the most perfect way I have ever found to engage with your partner. It's when you ask someone a question, it says, I am interested in your opinion. I see you here. I want to be here with you. I want you to tell me a thing. So that can be everything from, I had a really sexy dream. Do you want to hear me tell you about it? Or, hey, I know, that back massage last week seemed to go really well. Could we do that again? Or, you said that you really loved those clothes that I wore. What if I bought something new like that? Or you told me that you like being touched on your neck. Where on your neck do you like to be touched? If you don't know what to say, ask a question based on the thing that they told you, because that will always come back to, I see you. What you are saying is important to me. And it models the behavior that hopefully they will then demonstrate towards you.
I want to call out one thing. Well, you said a bunch of really valuable things, but one thing that you said in there that really hit home for me and is something that I feel like I need to remind myself both in romantic context, but also just life in general, is that your partner probably feels the same way. And I feel like we go through life thinking like, oh, we're so anxious. We're worried about what we look. We're worried about the things we say in meetings. We look at ourselves in the Zoom camera and, wonder, do we look okay? What do we look like when we're doing this particular thing? But everyone else is doing the same thing. They're not looking at you. They're anxious about what they have to say in the meeting and how they look. And so if we can just take a step back and remind ourselves, I don't really need to be all that anxious because people aren't focused on me. They're focused on themselves, and not that they should be, but it just, I think, can help us let go of some of these anxieties. And I think in the context of relationships and kind of having these conversations, just remembering that your partner probably also isn't sure how to broach these conversations. And they're also probably exploring it for the first time. And certainly they're doing it for the first time with you if you haven't done it yet. And so it can be something that you do together. And, I think it can be really freeing to realize that. At that point, there's no wrong. There's really just kind of exploring forward. So I just wanted to call that out because I thought that was a really kind of really resonant reminder or something that really resonated with me.
And I would also just say baby steps, small steps. Again, it
so you shouldn't just start talking about butt plugs in your fruit. No, kidding.
I mean, you can if that's your vibe, but I don't want to like yuck anyone's yum.
Did I just make this not safe for work, Laura? I'm sorry.
But like start little. Be like, let me tell you about this smell that I love, or let me tell you about this, this experience that I had, like being out sun tanning and the sun felt so good against my skin, or, it doesn't have to be full on all the time, and just share pleasure, see how that works. Respond to your partner, see them, acknowledge them. That's the thing that this is about, is the two people really engaging with each other. And then work your seduce and tease and flirt and work your way to whatever conversation you want to have next.
Yeah. I really want to amplify something you said earlier as well that really resonated with me, and it's a strategy I think maybe heard it in passing, but had never thought to implement it in my own life. And I think it's really applicable, not just in romantic relationships, but really in any relationship where if you're having a conversation with somebody and things are going in a direction that you don't really intend them to, being willing to stop the conversation, check in and say, hey, this isn't going where I intended it to, or where I think either of us want it to go. Let's restart. And I love that you said, especially making it playful, especially for the bedroom, where it's not just something's going to get awkward or weird and we're just going to stop immediately and now we're left on this kind of sour note, but we're going to challenge ourselves to try again. And that's the condition, is that we do try again. And I think that that's such a beautiful way to explore relationships, because I think that also helps people put on that training mindset, that learning mindset, that I'm here with you right now mindset. We're learning this together. I care about you. I care about where this is going. And I'm going to start trying to do that more often, just in my general life, in my personal life as well, because I really think that could be so effective in just like giving us more space to just be people.
It's like the video game. I want the reset button.
Yeah.
And I think that this is, I think, part and parcel of a really sex negative society, but we spend so much time telling people that the stakes are everything. Like if you mess it up and, you say the wrong thing, they'll hate you forever. And listen, be a good actor in the world. As Dan Savage says, be good, giving, and game. But if you are in a good relationship, like the stakes don't have to be everything. And part of I think a really useful thing is to just start with like, I want to play with you and I don't know where we're going to go and I don't know how it's going to go. And it's probably going to get awkward. It's probably going to get weird. And then we're going to like figure out what that was. And was that a good weird or was that a bad weird? Or like, I don't know, but let's like, that's a weird that maybe we'll just put down and come back to in a little while. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But giving yourselves the grace and the freedom and the space to play, including to fail, including to wander off in a direction that you didn't intend, and having everybody have a sense that this is not an all or nothing game, right? When one failure destroys everything, then that's a system in which the safest way to play that game is to not play it at all, right? Like if the smallest misstep is a full break of the system, then you just don't want to play. But if the smallest misstep is just a chance to learn better and climb higher on this great big mountain of fun and sexy play, then you absolutely want to be in this game because there's that mountain and you could get to the top of it.
Yeah.
Right? Giving people a sense that there's space to make mistakes, I think is a really valuable part of getting into intimacy and having intimacy work for both partners.
Yeah. So speaking of partners and dates, we would love to transition. Let's talk about Patrick and M's date. So curious, what were your initial thoughts on Patrick and M's communication during their Blink date?
So I thought, my first thought was like, that was a pretty decent date. I was impressed, they kept going. Like there wasn't a lot of really awkward pauses or kind of falls in the conversation where you were just like, oh, someone wants to leave now but doesn't know how. So I thought it was a pretty good date. I definitely thought they jumped topics a little bit, but they always kept moving, which was really good.
Were there any areas where you think their communication could have been improved?
I think that I noticed that Patrick, I think, was a much more of an open person, and M seemed a little bit more reticent, a little bit more like, she hadn't, it sort of like got late in the conversation where she revealed that where she lived and that wasn't what they thought, that even honestly from their names, like you have Patrick and you have M, like she just seemed a little bit, where my family comes from. It was all a little bit more reticent. And I think that could be personality difference, but it's certainly, I noticed the slight difference in the energy. That being said, she was there and like asking Patrick questions. And so it definitely wasn't that she wasn't interested entirely. And I think that's just a decision process for someone about how much they feel like disclosing private details when in the process.
Do you have any advice that you might give them on how to keep the momentum going if they matched and eventually met in person?
I mean, I think that I would love to have seen them deeper dive on something. And I think that for me is a real sign of like sparky engagement, is when it's not only, oh, we can talk about this topic, but like an hour just went by and we're still talking about this thing. And it's a process of dating, of finding those things that get you both really excited. But I did, and this is normal for a first date, first conversation, but I did notice that it was like a little bit of conversation about one thing, and then it was jumping over to a new topic and jumping over to a new topic and jumping over to a new topic. And I think in terms of dating and interaction, you want to find those places where you can keep talking about something for a while, not to the exclusion of absolutely everything else, but that you keep asking the other person more about that thing, and you go deeper in and you share more experiences. I mean, every time you switch topics, it's a little like, okay, I don't want to hear anything more about that from you.
Right.
And it's a very subtle signal, but it is there.
It's definitely like, I think going to what you were saying, like getting more depth. So, you're staying on the surface of each topic instead of digging deeper on each one. So I can definitely see how, and in first dates, like you said, it's fairly normal because you're meeting this person for the first time. You're figuring out how comfortable you feel opening up to them. And so it can be really easy to stay on that surface level of topics rather than digging deeper.
And you just have to find it, right? Like there's a million topics in the world. And so you got to kind of shuffle through a whole bunch of them before you find the one where both of you overlap with a passion on that. And so you skim a bit, but then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, we're actually both interested in 1950s contemporary furniture, like modern furniture. Like, okay, now let's deep dive. Like, but it took us a little while to figure out that thing that we
Right.
both got really interested in.
Right.
Yeah. And I think also too the context really matters for that initial conversation, because when you're doing a first date with someone, and in this case on the podcast, they only have 10 minutes to talk to each other.
Mhm.
And so I think that's something to for daters listening, if you are in kind of this speed sort of setting, I feel like it's also normal to try, or it's normal to want to speed through things to find that commonality, because generally people really want to continue the conversation, especially if they think someone is
Mhm.
interesting, they like the sound of their voice, whatever the case may be, and they're interested in that
Yeah.
connection. So they're like, okay, let's bam, 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 get through all these different topics as quickly as we possibly can to see where that snag is, so that we can go deeper on
Mhm.
that, because you don't want to spend the whole 10 minutes talking about something that maybe the other person's not as interested in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
almost wonder if that would be something that, yeah, just like giving people like tips and
No,
tactics
I
on,
I will
oh,
say
go
one
ahead.
of the things I was really impressed by is the fact that, neither of them really pontificated. I wasn't listening to a date where 5 minutes of it was someone just going off, like riffing on their own topic and not letting someone get a word in edgewise, right? They
Mhm.
were really attentive to, I'm going to say a little bit and then see where it goes. I'm going to say a little bit and see where it goes. They were engaged in listening for the other person's interest.
It really
No
seemed to me
soliloquies.
they were both very present. So I definitely had that feeling as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some takeaways from this date that you think are worth noting when it comes to navigating the dating sphere?
I would say, I think, having an I really liked this. I did notice the fact that there was a question about geography.
Mm.
I would just have put on there, might be a little practical tip is, if you're looking for someone local or if you're looking for someone distant, sort of understanding where that person lives
That's
compared to
that's on
you.
us. That's on me, human matchmaker. So sometimes geography, sadly, isn't one of the things I'm able to match by, but I do my
No,
best.
no. All no, all good, all good. It was just one of those, like, funny things to put there, but I really loved the way they bumped around on different topics and they talked about different things. I think listening to them talk, it was very clear one of the things they were both passionate and excited about talking about was, their own histories, because we are, but, like, when they were talking about, being in Boston or being on the Charles, or, things things like that, are where they'd live, living abroad for their study program. And as a tip for other daters, just those kinds of sharing pieces of your history that are really exciting are something I think everybody loves to do. So it was a really good visual of, like, oh yeah, I can ask someone else about, do they like to travel, or what's the favorite place they've been in the last few years, because that's something that people get really excited about and can lead to some really shared engagements.
So I have $1 million question for you, but no real
Please.
money involved.
Mhm.
Date in a blink. What did you think? Did they match? And why or why not do you think that they did or didn't?
Oh. So I think they matched. I think both of them, from my listening, it seemed like both of them were asking questions about the other person and were engaged with the other person. I would say, if I'm wrong about that, I felt like Patrick was more into it than, like, was even more eager than Em was, but that would be I'm going to go with they matched.
So I'll
What
share
did you
my
think,
guess.
Kelly?
Yeah. So I also thought that they would match. The conversation felt really easy and comfortable, and not, we've listened to a lot of dates, and we've definitely heard ones where they didn't have that level of ease, and so it felt
Mhm.
like to me that they would definitely want to continue chatting and getting to know one another. So Laura, what really happened?
Yeah, so you are both right. They did match.
Woohoo!
And so,
Yay!
Yay!
yeah, but I do think that in this case, I know that they said that they wanted to match with each other, but then the conversation didn't really take off. And I partially feel like that might be a geography thing. It is really hard to date someone across the country, even if you had such a great conversation. That's not to say we have talked to so many people who have had these kind of chance encounters with someone that lived not even just across the country, but in a different country on a different continent as themselves, made it work, and have been, together with someone for a very long time. So it's not to say that distance is a deal breaker, but I think that and just getting busy definitely impacted their ability to continue the conversation. But it was great. Some of the feedback we got is that they said it was a fun and unique experience. It reminded them of the Netflix show Love is Blind, which we do get a lot.
Nice.
And then also that they loved the audio format. They felt it was more relaxed than they usually feel when they go on dates, and it helped them lower these kind of superficial barriers that people put on themselves and on others, and it allowed them to focus more on being themselves, which fills my heart with joy.
Yes.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, a question we love to ask all of our experts. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for our audience?
I would say, be open to who you find. I think a million years ago, there was a dating app that had a on-staff statistician and used to do all kinds of interesting blog posts about the underlying data. And they looked at what the number one thing that their couples had in common when they made couples, and it was how they thought about horror movies.
Nuh-uh.
Like it wasn't,
Oh.
totally was. It was that was the thing that the most couples shared was that how they felt about horror movies. It wasn't religion. It wasn't family size. It wasn't education. It wasn't, you know what I mean? And honestly, just to be clear, it didn't matter what each partner thought about horror movies. The couple just had to have the same take. They could love them. They could hate them. They just had to share their belief in how they felt about horror movies.
So now that should be the litmus test as people go into dating. You just ask on the first date, what do you think about horror movies? I'm kidding. That shouldn't be. But it's crazy.
For me, it's just it's a clear indication that a lot of the time, I think the things that we think are important, what's your education, what kind of job do you have,
how tall
they're
are
not,
you?
yeah, exactly. They're not nearly as actually important to being the person that we're going to want to spend years of our lives with as we might think. So kind of being open to how and where you find that person and what that person looks like or has done in their life. Yeah, just be open.
You never know where love is going to find you.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that advice and for joining us today. And as our final
this was super
question,
fun.
how can our audience get connected with you?
Oh, well, you can find Amorus in the App Store. We are an iOS only app at the moment. So yes, Amorus is how you spell it. You can also find us on social media. We are at Amorus app everywhere where there are socials. And yeah, we always love to get feedback, always love to get people's opinions. You can sign up on our website, all kinds of stuff. But yes, Amorus is us. Amorus.
Amorus. All right. Well, thank you so much.
And I will put all of that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Perfect.
Ease of access.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. That's all we've got for you today. Shoot us a message on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at The Blink Date or at Date in a Blink to let us know what you think. If you want to try voice for speed dating from the comfort of your home, download the Blink Date app today. You can also sign up to participate in Date in a Blink by visiting our website at www.theblinkdate.com. In the meantime, thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed listening and look forward to talking with you again next time.